In my youth, and I'm a Gen Xer, I found that pushes for censorship came from the religious right. It was an all-out Christian attack on free speech. Baptist ministers and televangelists like Jerry Falwell mobilized millions of conservative Christian voters to attack nudity in film. They campaigned for the censorship of print and broadcast media that they labeled anti-family or pornographic. They wanted to ban books introducing multicultural ideas, cursing, or progressive social views that they believed defamed Christ and undermined Christian values. They weaponized local obscenity laws, which allowed community standards to dictate what was considered to be obscene. And holy hell broke out when Monty Python's Life of Brian was released in 1979. Christian groups organized massive pickets, successfully getting the movie banned by local councils across the UK and the US for allegedly mocking the life of Jesus. I attended Catholic school, so I found this movie hilarious, and I don't think they were mocking Jesus. They were mocking the times, though. But over the last decade, the overwhelming political pressure for regulating speech, policing language, creating speech codes, expanding hate speech definitions, mandatory pronoun policies, DI compliance, deplatforming controversial speakers, and demanding the removal of misinformation has largely come from the progressive left. And the justifications are almost always the same. Protect people from harm, protect marginalized groups, protect democracy, protect feelings, protect inclusion. Those goals sound compassionate. The problem is that compassion alone is not a governing principle. Fairness and justice require something more. They require protecting the rights of people you disagree with. It requires preserving our natural rights. If free speech belongs to only people with approved opinions, then it isn't a right at all. It's become a political privilege. It is crucial that you understand that there's a difference between speech you dislike and speech that someone has no right to say. Those two are not remotely the same thing. I hate racism. I hate anti-Semitism. I hate calls for violence. I hate propaganda. I hate conspiracy theories that destroy people's lives. I hate the manipulative lies, political rhetoric, whether it comes from the left or the right. But here's the thing. I don't have the moral authority to silence any of it. And neither do you. That idea sits at the very heart of natural rights. If you've been following this podcast, we've already established that natural rights don't come from government. They don't come from courts. They don't come from universities. And they don't come from the majority. These rights exist because human beings own themselves. These rights are innate. They are a product of our genetically coded justice instincts. They are the basis for morality. This concept is so important, as I mentioned earlier in the series, that I think it requires its own independent chapter. So strap in, because I think it's time for a brutal reality check. So with that, let's get started. Speech is simply the peaceful expression of your own mind. Nothing more, nothing less. Think this through for a second. If I express an opinion you disagree with, I haven't stolen your property. I haven't assaulted you. I haven't imprisoned you. I haven't forced you to believe me. I've merely offered an idea. An idea is not coercion. It's an invitation. You're free to reject it, ignore it, laugh at it, destroy it with evidence, convince me I'm wrong, or simply walk away. That's what liberty looks like. Adherence to natural rights can't guarantee in all cases whatsoever that you'll never hear anything you might find offensive. But liberty can guarantee that no one has authority to force your mind into submission. That distinction matters. Modern culture increasingly talks about the right to feel safe, but liberty never included a right to emotional comfort. There's no such thing, and there never will be. Liberty protects something so much more important: the freedom to think, the freedom to question, the freedom to disagree, the freedom to be wrong. Because without the freedom to be wrong, there can never be freedom to discover what is right. That's how every scientific discovery ever happened. Every philosophical breakthrough, every religious reform, every abolition movement, every revolution against tyranny. Every one of them began with someone saying something that offended the people in power. Every truth was once someone's heresy. Every scientific breakthrough was once someone's misinformation. Every reform movement was once someone's hate speech. If offensive ideas had been successfully outlawed throughout history, we'd probably still believe the Earth was the center of the universe. Women wouldn't vote. Slavery might exist. And we'd still be British subjects to the crown. Look, speech isn't merely a constitutional protection. It's the mechanism civilizations use to improve themselves. Long before constitutions, long before philosophers, long before Thomas Jefferson or John Locke, evolution already had this figured out. Speech didn't evolve because our ancestors wanted to be nicer to each other. It evolved because arguing increased the odds of survival. Imagine a tribe 20,000 years ago. Winter's coming. Food is scarce. The neighboring tribe is becoming aggressive. Someone claims there's a better hunting ground over the next mountain. Another says it's a trap. Who's right? Nobody knows. There was no satellite imagery, no Google Maps, no government fact checkers. There was only one tool available: argument. Speech became humanity's tool for solving uncertainty, and competing explanations produced better decisions than unquestioned authority. Think about every question our ancestors had to solve. Who's lying? Who's competent? Who's cheating? Who deserves leadership? Whose strategy has the greatest chance of keeping us alive? None of those questions could be answered by silence. They required criticism, debate, disagreement, evidence, public accountability. The groups that encouraged open disagreement became remarkably good at detecting bad ideas. The groups that discouraged disagreement became remarkably good at protecting them. That's not philosophy, that's selection pressure. And this is where evolutionary psychology becomes incredibly important. Earlier in the series, we talked about our innate sense of justice, about human beings possessing an extraordinary ability to detect unfairness, even how toddlers become upset when rewards are distributed unequally, and how chimpanzees reject unequal exchanges. I still remember that cucumber throwing. Across cultures, humans become angry when someone cheats, lies, manipulates, freeloads, or abuses power. Why? Because throughout evolutionary history, cheaters destroy tribes. If someone consistently took more than they contributed, lied about danger, claimed credit for somebody else's work, or manipulated people around them, the entire group became weaker. Natural selection rewarded groups that became exceptionally good at detecting those people. Psychologists sometimes call this our cheater detection system. I think of it as evolution's internal fraud department. But fraud detection only works if people are allowed to talk. Imagine trying to expose corruption when criticism is prohibited. Imagine trying to identify incompetence if questioning leadership becomes unacceptable. Imagine trying to uncover lies if accusations themselves are forbidden. The cheating doesn't disappear. Only the detection disappears. This is where modern conversations about censorship are completely disconnected. Supporters of speech regulation often assume that restricting criticism creates a kinder society. It does not. It creates a society where manipulation becomes easier. When criticism becomes dangerous, dishonest conformity becomes safer. When disagreement becomes taboo, lies become protected. When accusations become unacceptable, corruption flourishes. The very mechanism evolution gave us to identify bad ideas has been disabled. Now let's take it one step further. One misconception of modern politics is that disagreement is a sign of social failure. It's exactly the opposite. Our ancestors didn't discover the truth by everybody agreeing. They discovered truth by allowing competing explanations to fight it out. The strongest idea survived. Not because someone declared it to be true, but because it continued surviving every challenge thrown at it. That human nature process evolved and eventually became science. It became philosophy. It became constitutional government. It became free markets. It became the Enlightenment. Every one of those systems depends on the same underlying principle. No one gets the final definitive word. Every idea remains open to challenge. That's why free speech is so much more than just another political issue. It is the foundation that allows every other correction mechanism to function. Even morality depends upon criticism, because morality requires choice. If I persuade you through evidence, reason, and argument, then those beliefs become your own. If I force your silence through intimidation, censorship, or coercion, I haven't elevated your morality. I've merely replaced persuasion with power. That's not moral progress. That's intellectual tyranny. Which brings us to a question our current modern society needs to answer. What happens when a civilization begins treating disagreement itself as a form of harm? Because that's exactly what we're witnessing today. And once society starts punishing the very mechanism that allowed it to course correct, it doesn't become more compassionate. It becomes something far more dangerous. So how did we get here? How did a civilization built on the idea that disagreement creates progress arrive to the conclusion that disagreement itself is dangerous? Before we continue on this topic, I want to address an objection I hear all the time. I get hit with, are you saying people should be able to say absolutely anything, anywhere, at any time? No, that's never been my argument. Natural rights don't eliminate responsibility, but they do define who has legitimate authority to set the rules. One of the greatest misunderstandings in modern discussions about free speech is confusing government power with individual rights. Those are fundamentally different. The First Amendment exists because government possesses coercive power. Government can fine you, punish you, arrest you, imprison you. That is precisely why the Constitution limits what the government can do. Government doesn't own your mind. Therefore, government has no legitimate authority to decide which political opinions, religious beliefs, scientific hypotheses, or philosophical ideas you're allowed to express, simply because certain officials dislike them. Your right to free speech is protected from the government interference in the Bill of Rights, as it should be. Not only that, the government has a responsibility to protect your natural rights to free speech. Now, private businesses and organizations are different. Property rights matter. Freedom of association matters. If I own a restaurant, I have every right to establish reasonable standards of conduct inside my restaurant. If I'm running a business, I have every right to prohibit employees from insulting customers, harassing coworkers, or displaying messages that undermine a company's mission. Imagine a Hooters restaurant. Suppose a waitress decided she wanted to wear a large political button that read, "All men are misogynists." Does she have the right to hold that opinion? Absolutely. Does she have a right to publish a book saying it? Absolutely. Does she have a right to stand on a public sidewalk expressing that opinion? Absolutely. But does she have the right to use her employer's business while representing that business to broadcast a message likely to alienate its customers? No. The restaurant owns the brand. The restaurant owns the workplace. The restaurant bears the final consequences. Corporate management has every right to say, "Not while you're representing us, you're not." That isn't censorship. That's management. The same principle applies almost everywhere. A news anchor representing a network, a pilot representing an airline, a salesman representing a company. Employees don't stop being citizens when they go to work, but they do accept professional obligations and conditions while acting on behalf of someone else's organization. They don't like it, they don't have to work there. No one is forcing anyone to do anything. Now, government employment presents an even more complicated situation. A police officer wearing a badge is not merely expressing personal opinions. He represents the authority of the state. A judge represents impartial administration of justice. A military officer represents the armed forces. Many public employees, including teachers, prosecutors, intelligence officers, and law enforcement officers, occupy positions where their neutrality is essential to performing their duties. That doesn't mean they surrender their constitutional rights as private citizens, but it does mean government, like private employers, must impose reasonable restrictions on speech that directly interferes with official responsibilities, undermines public trust, or impairs the employee's ability to perform the job. Speaking as a private citizen is different from speaking as an official representative of an institution or government. As a private citizen, people remain free to disagree with you, to criticize you, to refuse to associate with you, to boycott your business, to terminate your employment if you're violating legitimate workplace policies. Freedom of speech has never meant freedom from social or professional consequences. What it has always meant is something much more profound, that no government should possess the authority to decide which peaceful ideas may exist in the minds and mouths of free citizens. That's the distinction. If this gets confusing, just remember, is the speech being regulated by coercion, or was it the product of consent? Now, your right to free speech does not include the right to prevent others from speaking, from exercising their right to free speech. That's another distinction that modern society seems to have forgotten. You absolutely have a right to protest. You have the right to disagree, to criticize, to carry signs, to organize demonstrations. They're all protected expressions of free speech. But your rights end precisely where you begin destroying somebody else's rights. You don't have the right to seize someone else's microphone. You don't have the right to storm a lecture hall so nobody else can hear the speaker. You don't have the right to occupy a stage simply because you dislike what's being said. You don't have the right to shut down a church service or to prevent a mosque from holding prayers. You don't have the right to disrupt a synagogue or to stop a political rally. You don't have the right to silence a college lecture. And you don't have the right to prevent anyone from speaking. This principle doesn't change depending on whose politics I prefer. Natural rights don't care whether you agree with a speaker. Either peaceful assembly belongs to everybody, or eventually it belongs to no one. If you believe a church is teaching false doctrine, preach a better sermon somewhere else. If you believe a university speaker is completely wrong, rent another auditorium and explain why. Compete, don't interfere. Persuade, don't intimidate. That's how free societies solve disagreement. What we've increasingly witnessed over the last decade, particularly on many university campuses, is something fundamentally different. Not protest, but disruption. Not persuasion, but obstruction. Not argument, but prevention. Invited speakers are shut down. Fire alarms are pulled. Entrances are blocked. Events are canceled because administration fears unrest. Students are prevented from hearing speakers they voluntarily chose to attend. Think about how backwards that is. The protesters claiming they're defending democracy by preventing other people from listening. They claim they're protecting free expression by eliminating someone else's opportunity to express an idea. That isn't speech, that's coercion. Freedom of speech protects your right to add your voice to the conversation. It does not grant you the authority to end the conversation. Now, ironically, I don't think most advocates of free speech regulation are trying to destroy free speech. I think many sincerely believe they're making society more compassionate. The argument usually sounds something like this. Words can cause psychological harm. Certain ideas reinforce prejudice. Some opinions marginalize vulnerable groups. Misinformation threatens democracy. False narratives can lead to violence. Therefore, society has a moral obligation to restrict speech before it causes damage. On the surface, that's an emotionally compelling argument. Who doesn't want less hatred? Who doesn't want fewer lies? Who doesn't want people treated with dignity? The problem isn't the objective. The problem is the mechanism, the way you get there. History teaches us something every systems engineer learns early in his career. No complex system becomes more reliable by eliminating negative feedback. In fact, it's the opposite. Healthy systems constantly detect errors, report errors, and correct errors. If you suppress the reporting because the reports make people feel uncomfortable, the errors don't disappear. They accumulate. Eventually, the system fails. Not because it had problems, but because it stopped detecting them and therefore couldn't fix them. Let me give you a simpler example. Imagine covering the check engine light on your dashboard with black tape. Congratulations, the warning light is gone. But the engine isn't fixed. In fact, you made the problem worse because you've removed the very thing telling you something's wrong. Censorship works the same way. Silencing criticism doesn't solve problems. It merely hides them until it's much more expensive to fix. We've talked throughout this podcast series about incentives. Human beings don't simply respond to rules. We adapt to them. Change the incentives, you change the behavior. That's exactly what's happened across many of our institutions. Increasingly, the incentive is no longer to discover the truth. The incentive is to avoid saying something that could be interpreted as offensive. Clearly, those are not the same objectives. One rewards independent thinking. The other rewards social conformity. One rewards intellectual courage. The other rewards caution at best, cowardice at worst. That shift has become especially visible within universities. A university should be the place where every assumption is open to a challenge, where every student learns to defend ideas rather than hide from criticism, where bad arguments lose because better arguments expose them. Increasingly, however, many universities have embraced a very different philosophy. Students are encouraged to think in terms of oppression hierarchies. Speech is increasingly evaluated not by whether it's true, but by whether it is perceived as harmful. Intent becomes secondary to impact. Disagreement becomes evidence of insensitivity. Simple questions become microaggressions, and certain conclusions gradually become socially unacceptable to question. This is where critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and related ideological frameworks become relevant. I personally loathe the hateful anti-white racist garbage that the CRC advocates preach. They create division by pitting blacks and non-blacks against each other based on false narratives and odious storytelling and lies. To be clear, every society should examine discrimination. Every institution should ask whether people are being treated fairly. Those are worthwhile discussions. The problem begins when those social justice frameworks cease being hypotheses that can be challenged and instead become moral doctrines that cannot. Once an idea becomes morally unquestionable, it begins behaving like theology. Our universities have stopped asking questions and have begun to start enforcing answers. Over the past decade, we've seen numerous examples of invited speakers being disinvited after activist campaigns. Others have been shouted down before they could even begin speaking. Faculty members have described investigations, public denunciations, or professional consequences after expressing disagreement with prevailing views on race, sex, gender identity, or DEI policies. Some universities have required diversity statements during the hiring or promotion process, which creates or pressures applicants to demonstrate ideological alignment rather than simply academic competence. And it's been working. And you don't need to punish everyone. You only need to punish enough people so that everybody else notices. It's the kill one, scare thousand strategy. And that's how self-censorship begins. The most effective censorship rarely involves police officers. It happens inside your own head. Out of fear of being branded by society, you begin calculating every sentence. Could this be misunderstood? Will somebody file a complaint? Will this affect my promotion, my tenure, my friendships, my reputation? Eventually, you stop asking questions. You stop discussing. And you stop learning. Not because you've changed your mind, but because you've calculated the cost of saying what you think. That's a horrible transformation. And it's happening today. The free marketplace of ideas hasn't become more competitive, it's become less competitive. Ideas are no longer surviving because they're stronger, they're surviving because they're protected, no matter how delusional they are. Other ideas disappear because challenging them carries a professional risk. This isn't intellectual evolution, it's artificial selection, and artificial selection always changes the population. Remember our discussion about selective breeding? Breed only the calmest foxes, and eventually you'll produce an entire different kind of fox? Well, reward only the most conforming employees, and you'll eventually produce an entirely different kind of institution. That same thing happens intellectually. Reward courage, and courageous people rise. Reward conformity, and conformists rise. Reward ideological loyalty, and ideological loyalists eventually occupy positions of influence. Today, we call those people liberal and progressives. But this isn't about conservatives versus liberals. It's about selection pressure. The environment determines which behaviors flourish. And today's political environment is increasingly rewarding emotional signaling over evidence, activism over skepticism, narrative alignment over uncomfortable truths. And that has consequences. The people most likely to succeed become those who instinctively ask, what am I allowed to say? Instead of asking, what is actually true? This is an extraordinary, dangerous cultural shift, and we see it getting worse every year. Disagreement becomes hate. Questions become denial. Skepticism becomes misinformation. Criticism becomes violence. Once those labels become accepted, censorship no longer feels authoritarian. It feels compassionate. Because after all, who could possibly oppose reducing harm? That's precisely why speech regulation has become so politically attractive. Look, compassion is one of humanity's greatest virtues. But compassion without reason, without limits, without competing principles, without natural rights, can become surprisingly coercive. If preventing emotional discomfort becomes the highest moral value, then almost any restriction becomes justifiable. Silence the speaker, remove that book, cancel that lecture, fire that professor, delete that post, suspend that account, kill the speaker to protect people from hearing his dangerous ideas. But dangerous to whom? That's the question every generation forgets to ask. Every censor in history believed they were protecting society. The church protected souls. Kings protected public order. Socialists and communists protect equality. Fascists protect the nation. McCarthyists protected America. Today's censors often speak the language of inclusion, safety, equity, or misinformation. The vocabulary changes, but the incentive structure doesn't. Those who possess the authority to define unacceptable speech inevitably acquire the authority to define unacceptable thought. And I, for one, will not yield to that. One defining characteristic of a free society is that disagreement remains protected even when it's unpopular. Take, for example, critical race theory, or Derek Bell's Faces at the Bottom of the Well. I, too, dislike hate speech, and it angers me. I read their books because I wanted to hear what they had to say, straight from the horse's mouth, without someone else's bias or filtering. The whole time I was thinking, Richard Delgado, Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, you guys can go screw yourselves. But I chose to read their vile propaganda. Nobody forced me, and I would never support banning these books. Why? Because the answer to bad ideas has to be better ideas. The answer to flawed reasoning has to be stronger reasoning. The answer to speech is more counter-speech. Not government, not administrators, not censorship. If I can't defeat an argument in the open, then I haven't demonstrated my position is stronger. And if I censor you, I've only demonstrated that I possess more power. History has shown us that every tool created to silence today's opponent eventually becomes available to silence tomorrow's dissenter. Which brings us to the next, and perhaps the most dangerous phase of censorship. What happens when speech isn't merely censored, but when people beginning to believe that those who express certain ideas are so dangerous that they no longer deserve to speak at all? That's when censorship begins crossing the line into intimidation, coercion, and sometimes into violence. You know, another misconception I see Americans have is believing that freedom of speech is a normal condition of civilization. It isn't. In fact, throughout most of human history, governments have claimed the authority to decide which ideas may be expressed, which criticisms are acceptable, and which opinions deserve punishment. The United States is the historical exception. It was intentional. The founders had spent generations watching kings imprison critics, churches prosecute heretics, governments censor newspapers, and political leaders silence opposition. They reached a conclusion. Government simply cannot be trusted to determine the truth. Not because government officials are uniquely evil, but because they're human. Human beings are tribal. Human beings become emotionally invested in their beliefs. Human beings convince themselves they're acting for the greater good. And human beings are extraordinarily good at rationalizing the use of power. That's why the First Amendment is so extraordinary. It doesn't ask governments to protect their correct ideas. It prevents the government from deciding which peaceful ideas are correct in the first place. That distinction changes everything. Most nations begin by asking, what speech should the government allow? America asked a far better question. What authority should the government have over peaceful speech? The answer was simple. Almost none. The government doesn't own your mind, doesn't own your conscience, doesn't own your beliefs. And because it doesn't own them, it has no legitimate authority to punish you simply because your opinions offend those in power. That's one of the greatest achievements in political philosophy. It recognizes something deeper than constitutional law. It recognizes natural rights. That is why freedom of speech is not merely another constitutional protection. It is a recognition that your mind belongs to you. Unfortunately, most of the world chose a different path. Instead of limiting government, they empowered it. Instead of asking government to protect liberty, they asked government to regulate ideas. And once that door opens, history suggests it rarely closes again. Many Americans hear criticism of foreign speech laws and immediately think authoritarian dictatorships. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about modern democracies, countries with elections, independent courts, and free markets. And yet many of these governments possess legal authority that would be considered astonishingly tyrannical under the First Amendment. Take the United Kingdom. Britain remains one of America's closest allies. It gave the world John Locke, the Magna Carta, parliamentary government, many of the philosophical traditions that eventually inspired the American Revolution. Yet modern Britain has dramatically taken a different path on freedom of speech. British laws allow criminal prosecution for certain electronic communications that are deemed grossly offensive. Think about that phrase, grossly offensive. Not violence, not theft, not assault, not fraud. Offensive. Who decides what's offensive enough to become criminal? The government. That alone should make every American uncomfortable. One of the most famous examples that I'm aware of is a British case that involved Mark Meakin, better known online as Count Dankula. To annoy his girlfriend, he trained her pug to raise its paw whenever he said phrases associated with Nazi Germany. It was juvenile. It was intended as dark humor. Millions of people thought it was stupid. Others thought it was funny. But some people found it offensive. That's how comedy works. But instead of allowing society to judge the joke, government intervened. Meakin was prosecuted and convicted because officials determined the video was grossly offensive. Think about what just happened. Police officers became arbiters of comedy. Judges became critics of satire. Government became responsible for deciding whether a joke crossed the line from tasteless to criminal. Free speech was never designed to protect tasteful jokes. Tasteful jokes don't need constitutional protection. The entire purpose of free speech is protecting expression that somebody else finds offensive. Otherwise, there's no principle at all. Britain has also prosecuted individuals over offensive Facebook posts, online memes, rap lyrics quoted on social media, and heated online arguments. I mean, Jesus Christ, what the hell is going on over there? If the government can arrest you today, search your home, publicly identify you, cost you your job, your freedom has already been diminished. The punishment isn't merely the conviction, the punishment is the process. Denmark recently passed legislation making it a criminal offense in many cases to publicly desecrate sacred religious texts, including the Quran and the Bible. Supporters argued that the law would reduce international tensions and protect public order. But again, consider the underlying principle. Does a book possess rights, or do people possess rights? This goes back to the first chapters in the series on property rights. If someone burns a copy of the Communist Manifesto, they haven't destroyed Marxism. Ideas don't possess natural rights. People do. Across much of Europe, the debate is no longer whether the government should regulate speech. The debate has simply become where the line should be drawn. Should it prohibit hate speech? Should it prohibit offensive speech? Should it prohibit misinformation? Should it prohibit religious insult? Should it prohibit historical denial? Very few people ask the American question, should the government possess this authority at all? That question is the true dividing line, because history repeatedly demonstrates something remarkably consistent. Government never begins by banning ordinary political discussion. They begin with speech almost everybody dislikes. They label speech as threats, incitement, extremism, hatred. Then the definitions gradually expand. Offensive becomes harmful. Harmful becomes dangerous. Dangerous becomes unacceptable. And unacceptable becomes illegal. Every individual step appears reasonable. Very few societies wake up one morning announcing, today we're becoming authoritarian. Instead, they redefine one category of speech as too dangerous to tolerate, then another, until eventually citizens begin asking themselves a question that free people should never have to ask. Am I still allowed to say what I honestly believe? That's precisely the question the First Amendment was designed to prevent. The American Founding Fathers understood something many societies continue to rediscover the hard way. Government should never become the final referee of truth, because the moment government acquires that authority, free speech ceases to be a natural right and becomes a temporary privilege. And privileges can always be revoked. The United States is special, far more than I think most Americans realize. And it bothers me when I see simple-minded fools attacking our founding fathers, tearing down their statues and vandalizing historical monuments. Why? Because from their perspective, they do not live up to the moral standard we use today. They do not see or realize that in the world back then, every nation was bad. Every one. But of all the nations in the world, the United States was the only one built on individual rights, built on the concept of natural and inalienable rights. They instituted a moral foundation, albeit not perfect, that allowed us to flourish in ways other countries could not and did not. Which brings us to an even darker lesson. While Western Europe demonstrates how offensive speech can gradually become a police matter, other governments show us where censorship could ultimately lead. Prison, torture, forced labor, execution, and sometimes death on a scale almost too large for human mind to process. This is why debates about free speech are not merely debates about manners, offensive jokes, or hurt feelings. Once a government claims authority to decide which ideas may be criticized, there's obviously no stopping point. It becomes about protecting public harmony, then political stability, then government institutions themselves, and eventually it protects the people in power. For example, several Muslim-majority countries retain blasphemy laws that criminalize the criticism of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, and other religious doctrines. In some of those countries, the legal penalty is death. Not for murder, not for rape, not for terrorism. Death for words. Death for expression of an opinion. Death for questioning a religious claim. And in some places, potential death for changing your own mind. Pakistan is one of the clearest examples. A Christian farm worker got involved in a dispute with a Muslim co-worker over drinking water. The confrontation led to allegations that she had insulted the Prophet Muhammad. For those alleged words, she was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. Now, she spent nearly a decade in prison before Pakistani Supreme Court finally acquitted her, but still, these cases are rampant. A Pakistani academic was accused of posting blasphemous materials online. He spent several years in prison, much of it in solitary confinement, until he was sentenced to death. Again, the issue is not whether we approve of what he allegedly said. That's irrelevant. No government possesses a moral right to execute peaceful human beings for expressing an opinion about religion. Saudi Arabia is another example. A blogger created an online forum where people could discuss religion and politics. Discuss. Not bomb, not assault, not overthrow the government through violence. Discuss. For opening up that forum, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, fined heavily, and sentenced to 1,000 lashes. 1,000 lashes. For a website. If a religious doctrine requires prisons, whips, police officers, and executioners to protect it from criticism, perhaps the weakness is not in the criticism. Iran has likewise prosecuted people for allegedly insulting religious figures online. It's imprisoned, tortured, and executed dissidents under vaguely defined offenses such as waging war against God or the corruption on earth. Iran's repression is not some secret historical footnote. During the 2019 November protests, Amnesty International eventually verified that at least 323 people were killed by Iranian security services in only 5 days. Most were reportedly shot in the head or torso, and the killings were concealed behind a nationwide internet shutdown. During the 2022 uprising, security forces again fired live ammunition and metal pellets at the protesters. Amnesty International documented children among the dead and described the killings, beatings, torture, and sexual violence. More recently, during the far larger crackdown that followed the protests beginning in late 2025, human rights activists reported at least 2,500 deaths by January 2026, along with more than 18,000 detentions. Having said that, I've heard claims that the numbers were closer to 40,000 people massacred. However, since Iran censors that information, it's hard to verify this. Why aren't these so-called empathetic American-hating Americans screaming about that? In Afghanistan, under the Taliban's interpretation of Islamic law, apostasy, that means leaving Islam, may itself be treated as a capital offense. Imagine living under a government that claims ownership not merely of your actions, but over your conscience. You're not allowed to worship differently. You're not allowed to decide you no longer want to believe. You're not allowed to honestly say, I changed my mind. If your conscience doesn't belong to you, what does? That's the essential natural rights distinction. People possess rights. Ideas do not. Religions do not possess a right to be protected from criticism. Prophets do not possess a governmental veto over speech. Political ideologies do not possess a right to remain unquestioned. Every idea must remain open to examination. The moment the government declares one belief legally immune from criticism, it's stopped protecting people. It's begun protecting orthodoxy. But religious theocracies are not the only systems that claim ownership of truth. Throughout the 20th century, Marxist governments repeatedly demonstrated that controlling speech is essential to controlling a socialist state. These systems were built on Marxist class ideology, state control of major economic life, suppression of private institutions, and the belief that government may reconstruct society from the top down. These systems have a special censorship problem because their economic and political theories require enormous concentrations of power. To reorganize an entire society, the government must control property. To control property, it must control institutions. To control institutions, it must suppress organized resistance. To suppress organized resistance, it must control information. And to control information, it eventually must control speech. That progression is not accidental. It's built into the incentive structure. A competitive market permits millions of people to make independent decisions. A communist or socialist system tries to substitute it with central planning. But central planners cannot tolerate constant public resistance to the plan. They cannot easily admit that production targets are failing. They can't allow citizens to compare government promises with independent evidence. They cannot tolerate competing centers of economic or political power. So criticism becomes sabotage. Failure becomes misinformation. And the person who points out the disaster becomes an enemy of the people. That's why virtually every major Marxist or Leninist government has established censorship, propaganda, political prisons, secret police, and a one-party control. The Soviet Union. It did not merely censor a few offensive opinions. It attempted to build an entire civilization around an officially approved version of reality. The Communist Party controlled newspapers, publishing, schools, universities, political organizations, and public debate. There was no legitimate opposition party. There was no independent press capable of investigating the government. There was no free marketplace in which competing political and economic ideas could organize. During Stalin's Great Terror, millions of innocent Soviet citizens were sent to labor camps or killed in prison. The objective was not merely to remove a few conspirators, it was to terrorize the public into submission. And it worked. People learned not to speak honestly. Co-workers denounced one another. Neighbors disappeared. Confessions were manufactured. Show trials presented predetermined conclusions as justice. Eventually, mass arrests weren't even necessary because fear had already moved into the minds of the population. The censorship became internal. People didn't ask what is true. People asked what is safe to say. That is the final victory of authoritarianism. The government no longer has to censor every citizen. Citizens censor themselves. And then we have China. During the Great Leap Forward, Mao attempted to transform China rapidly through collectivized agriculture, communal living, backyard steel production, and centrally imposed production demands. It was a socialist dream. Local officials were under enormous pressure to report success, so they did what every socialist does when their plans fail. They lied. Failed harvests became record harvests. Empty fields became evidence of abundance. Starving villages were described as prosperous. It's kind of like what happens in our democratic cities today. The statistics on crime are easily manipulated. One way to reduce crime is to change the definition of the crime. Change a felony to a misdemeanor to a fine. Instead of arresting somebody, let them go. Or simply just cook the books, as a lot of them have already been caught doing. There are a lot of ways. But during the Great Leap Forward, after fabricating their success in those reports, grain was taken away from communities based on these fictional production numbers, while people who questioned the program risked being denounced as enemies of socialism. Reality had not disappeared. The permission to report reality had disappeared. Scholarly estimates vary, but resulting famine is commonly estimated to have killed somewhere between 15 million and 45 million people. 45 million people. That's insane. And again, they did not all die because Mao personally ordered each death. They died because the socialist system had destroyed honest feedback. Officials could not safely admit failure. Journalists could not expose what was happening. Political opponents could not organize. Independent institutions could not challenge the plan. When the state controlled the farms, the food, the media, the statistics, and the permitted explanation, the population had nowhere to run. Then came China's Cultural Revolution. Professors were humiliated, teachers were beaten, intellectuals were imprisoned, books were destroyed, historical and religious sites were attacked. Naive and indoctrinated students were encouraged to identify enemies of the socialist revolution. Depending on how deaths are counted, historians commonly estimate hundreds of thousands, and possibly 1 to 2 million people died during this cultural revolution. Millions more were persecuted, displaced, imprisoned, tortured, or publicly degraded. It was ideological purification. The revolution demanded loyalty. Loyalty required conformity. Conformity required silence, and the silence protected the people causing the catastrophe. Now, modern China is no longer economically identical to Mao's China. The Communist Party has permitted markets and free enterprise where they serve the state's objective, but it has not surrendered political control. China now operates perhaps as the most technologically sophisticated censorship system in history. Foreign news sources are blocked, search results are filtered, social media is monitored, forbidden posts disappear, accounts disappear, and sometimes people disappear. Political opposition can't organize openly. Independent journalism exists only within the boundaries permitted by the Communist Party. And now, artificial intelligence and mass surveillance allow authorities to monitor communications at a scale Stalin could not even have dreamed of. This is the modern face of authoritarian socialism. Algorithms, databases, facial recognition, location tracking, automated filtering. And again, the state does not need to arrest everyone. It only needs citizens to know that it can identify them. This is where the U.S. is heading if we don't course correct these progressive and socialist Fruit Loops. Then we have Cuba. Independent journalism has been suppressed, political dissidents have been jailed, and media is controlled by the state. Internet access has been restricted during unrest, and citizens criticizing the government have faced arrest and prosecution. The Cuban Revolution promised equality, dignity, and liberation. This socialist government created an economic failure, and the Cuban people live in horrible conditions now. Horrible. The national electrical grid collapses regularly. Rolling power cuts last up to 20 to 22 hours per day in most provinces. These prolonged blackouts mean that water pumps stop functioning. forcing residents to go days or weeks without running water. And because refrigerators lack power, families watch their tightly rationed food spoil rapidly in the tropical heat. 70% of Cubans are regularly skipping meals due to scarcity and a plunging peso. Fuel shortages prevent tractors from harvesting crops and trucks from distributing what food is grown, causing the food production to drop by 60%. Trash collection trucks don't have the diesel, leading to huge piles of rotting garbage and waste accumulating on the public streets in Havana. Tens of thousands of elective and essential surgeries are suspended because hospitals lack electricity, surgical supplies, and clean bedsheets. Cuba's infant mortality rate has more than doubled. Doctors and nurses are increasingly fleeing the profession or the country entirely due to the slave wages, averaging roughly $20 a month. This is the reality of socialism, the end result when the money runs out. This is the same system, the Cuban system, that the American idiots like Bernie Sanders, AOC, and Mamdani are trying to push here in the U.S. Even the far-left United Nations describe living conditions in Cuba as a life-threatening humanitarian emergency. And when the Cuban citizens attempt to speak freely and complain about the failures, the government punishes them for supposedly undermining the revolution. The regime cannot permit open comparison between its promises and the results because the discrepancy is too large. Censorship becomes essential not to protect the population from misinformation, but to protect the government from accurate information. And lastly, I'll give you another example. There's North Korea, which is what remains after a socialist state eliminates virtually every competing institution. There is no freedom of speech, no independent press, no organized political opposition, no open internet, no freedom to criticize the ruling family, no meaningful private economy independent of state permission, foreign media is prohibited or severely punished, political disloyalty can lead to forced labor, torture, imprisonment, disappearance, or execution. In many reported cases, punishment extends to the relatives of the accused. The government doesn't merely control what people say, it attempts to control the information from which independent thoughts might develop. Generations of citizens have lived without meaningful access to outside evidence. They cannot easily compare government propaganda with reality because access to reality has itself been criminalized. This is the endpoint of totalitarian information control. The government does not win arguments, it prevents arguments from existing. This is why the history of Marxism and communism must be discussed honestly. These governments did not produce censorship because their revolutions were implemented badly. Broad censorship was necessary to maintain systems that concentrated political, economic, and informational power in the same hands. When government controls your employment, your housing, your food, your education, your media, your political participation, and the legal definition of acceptable speech, you're basically a full-blown slave to the state with no liberty. I am flabbergasted with the ignorance and susceptibility of Americans who favor socialism. They try to hook you with free stuff based on economic fallacies. But the real danger of socialism increases as it moves beyond a limited economic policy and becomes a comprehensive theory of social control. And the more speech it controls, the less peacefully anybody can resist. Now, this doesn't prove that every public program inevitably leads to tyranny, but it does prove that concentrations of power require extraordinary skepticism, constitutional limits, private alternatives, and protected dissent. Otherwise, the government becomes the regulator, employer, landlord, educator, broadcaster, prosecutor, and the final judge of what criticism is permissible. At that point, rights no longer function as rights. They become privileges issued by the state. Keep in mind, the 20th century did not produce its worst atrocities because citizens were allowed to criticize the government too freely. It produced them because governments accumulated enough power to silence those who warned everybody else. Censorship prevented correction. It protected failed policies. It silenced witnesses. It allowed leaders to substitute propaganda for reality. And we're starting to see the cracks here in the U.S. as well. Federal and local governments are protecting a buttload of failed policies. They are silencing or ignoring whistleblowers. They have hidden information from the public and intentionally spread misinformation and continue to lie to the people. That should be a warning. Marxism becomes extremely dangerous when class identity replaces individual rights, and political opponents become enemies of history. And socialism becomes catastrophic when the party claims exclusive authority to represent the people, and therefore treats anyone who disagrees with them as the enemy of the people. Once criticism becomes treason, mistakes become permanent. Once dissent becomes violence, government violence becomes justified. Once the state owns the truth, human beings become raw material for the plan. And history has already shown us the body count. Now, I get it. After looking at Iran, Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao's China, Cambodia, Cuba, North Korea, it would be easy for an American to lean back and say, well, thank God that would never happen here. Maybe, as long as we keep our natural rights to bear arms to defend ourselves against socialist tyranny. But every civilization that lost its freedom once believed it was different. You think Cubans would have supported Castro if they knew how it would turn out? Hell no. They, like every horrific example I listed, believe in the socialist dream like every American progressive socialist does today. And America will not necessarily lose its freedoms because soldiers suddenly occupy television stations or police begin dragging millions of people from their homes. Freedom can disappear long before that. It can disappear psychologically. It can disappear when citizens become too afraid to use it. It can disappear when children grow up believing that speech is dangerous, disagreement is cruelty, emotional discomfort is oppression, and authority should decide which ideas are safe to hear. That is the danger facing America now. For years, Americans have been increasingly told that exposure to offensive ideas can constitute harm, that words may be violence, that disagreement can make a space unsafe, that certain students need protection from hearing arguments that challenge their identities, political beliefs, or their understanding of the world. And again, I understand the compassionate instinct. Nobody wants students bullied. Nobody wants children humiliated. Nobody wants racial harassment, threats, or cruelty normalized. But there's an enormous difference between protecting somebody from harassment and protecting somebody from disagreement. One develops security. The other develops dependency. A safe home can help a child grow. A padded intellectual room can prevent them from growing at all. As we've discussed in previous chapters, human beings develop strength through manageable adversity. We build muscles by placing them under resistance. We build immune responses through exposure. We build judgment by making choices. We build courage by confronting fear. And we build intellectual strength by hearing arguments that make us uncomfortable and learning how to answer them. Remove every challenge, and you don't create strong, compassionate adults. You create adults who require someone else to control the environment for them. Adults who can't tolerate contradiction. Adults who interpret criticism as hostility. Adults who treat disagreement as a personal attack. Adults who demand institutions remove the speaker because they never learned how to defeat the argument. That's not kindness. That's manufacturing fragility. Safe spaces are sold as places where people can temporarily recover, gather support, or speak privately. But when an entire university, workplace, or country is expected to function as a safe space, the concept becomes destructive. Life is not a safe space. Society is not a safe space. Science is not a safe space. Marriage is not a safe space. Business is not a safe space. And reality is certainly not a safe space. Reality does not consult your emotional comfort before delivering consequences. And a civilization that trains people to confuse discomfort with danger will eventually produce citizens incapable of confronting either. Oversensitivity does not create morality. It creates fear. It creates resentment. And yes, it creates weak men and fragile minds. Not physically weak, morally and intellectually weak. It creates people who have never developed the courage to hear, "You may be wrong." In addition, we have another problem. Millions of Americans have inherited freedoms they never had to earn, defend, or even seriously think about. They were born into a country where they could criticize the president, mock Christianity, condemn capitalism, praise socialism, burn the flag, denounce the military, call America racist, oppressive, colonistic, sexist, or fundamentally evil. And then they go home safely. The level of freedom is so normal to them that they mistake it for a natural condition of humanity. It is not. These delusional Americans are living in fantasyland. Throughout most of human history, publicly insulting the king, church, ruling party, tribe, or dominant ideology could lead you to exile, prison, torture, or death. In many countries, it still can. I have little respect for these entitled, ignorant American idiots. They enjoy the protections of the First Amendment while insisting the country protecting their criticism is irredeemably oppressive. This is more than historical ignorance. It's ingratitude. You don't have to believe America's perfect. It's not. Nor do you have to ignore slavery, segregation, injustice, corruption, or failed wars. And no one's asking you to. A mature patriotism is not blind loyalty. It's an honest recognition that a country may contain some failures while still possessing principles worth defending. But there's something profoundly backwards about despising the civilization that gives you the freedom to express your contempt, while romanticizing political systems that would never permit that kind of criticism. The American flag can be burned, and that's the way it should be, because America was built on the premise of liberty, freedom of speech, of expression. That's what makes our country special. Try burning the communist flag in Beijing. Try publicly mocking the ruling family in North Korea. Try denouncing the revolution in Havana. Try ridiculing the Prophet Muhammad in the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Try organizing an unauthorized movement against the Iranian regime. The difference is not theoretical. The difference is life or death. Americans should criticize their government. That's part of our tradition. And our government is currently out of control. If Jefferson were alive today, he too would be criticizing it. But criticism without gratitude becomes entitlement. And as citizens from other countries have already learned, those who take freedom for granted will not recognize its value until they've surrendered it. Which is why we must fight to protect freedom of speech and stop shaming our citizens and our youth for speaking their minds and asking legitimate questions. We must fight back against speech regulation, the mandated use of pronouns, politically correct and woke terminology, the systematic redefinition of our language, where the meaning of racism, misogyny, sexism, masculinity are corrupted. I will never use the term Latinx to describe myself. You can take that term and shove it up your ass. And arguably, most importantly, we must not normalize unwarranted self-censorship. Look, self-censorship is sometimes reasonable. A mature person does not announce every thought that enters his head. We exercise judgment. We choose the appropriate time, place, and manner. If we are decent, we avoid humiliating people unnecessarily. That is courtesy. That is discipline. That is not what I'm describing. What I'm describing is the suppression of sincere, peaceful beliefs because people fear social destruction, professional retaliation, academic penalties, or being branded morally unclean. That's the kind of self-censorship that changes people. It rewards dishonesty. It teaches individuals to say what is socially useful rather than what they truly believe. It creates two-faced personalities, the private person and the public persona. At home, people say what they think. At work, they recite the approved answer. Among trusted friends, they question the ideology. In public, they display loyalty. This bullshit status quo has got to stop. We need to push back. Not everyone agrees or believes the official politically correct doctrine, and it won't take long before everyone merely behaves as though everyone else believes it. Eventually, nobody knows what the population truly thinks because honest disagreement has vanished from view. The result is a manufactured consensus. A manufactured consensus that is extremely dangerous because our political leaders begin mistaking silence for agreement. Institutions conclude that their policies are popular. Social science professors assume their theories have defeated competing explanations. Politicians believe their mandates are stronger than they are. Then reality arrives, usually in elections, institutional collapse, public backlash, or social unrest. I have no evidence to prove this, but I think that's probably why Trump was reelected. In a way, it was an indictment on this younger and dumber socialist and progressive generation. But this is not merely speculation about the next generation. The change is already visible. By this point in the series, it should not surprise us that female students are more likely than males to favor protective or restrictive speech regulation in general. Studies show that 74% of these women favor actions like implementing safe spaces, disciplining threatening speech, and viewing speech as damaging like violence. The other group majority that supports suppression of speech are liberals and Democrats. Another survey found that 70% of students believe speech can be as damaging as physical violence. It also found a substantial support for safe spaces, speech codes, and disinviting certain speakers. Again, as we discussed in previous chapters, about 85% of students are in non-STEM or liberal social sciences. In a 2024 study, roughly two-thirds of college students reported self-censoring on at least one frequently discussed campus topic. Two-thirds also said self-censorship limits educationally valuable conversations. Students were especially likely to hold back on gender and LGBTQ, race, and religion. Think about what that means. The university, the institution supposedly dedicated to inquiry, has become a place where a large number of students calculate whether honesty is worth the risk. Not whether their claim is true, whether it's safe. That represents a profound, horrible moral shift. When a society begins teaching that words are violence, it opens up the door to claiming that violence against a speaker is self-defense. Once someone's opinion is described as an attack, silencing him becomes protection. Disrupting his lecture becomes resistance. Destroying his livelihood becomes accountability. And attacking him may be rationalized as preventing harm. This is where careless language becomes dangerous. We've also normalized the vocabulary of microaggressions. Originally, the concept attempted to describe subtle, often unintended slights that may accumulate over time. But the concept can easily expand until almost any awkward question, imperfect phrase, disagreement, assumption, joke, or failure to use the proved terminology becomes evidence of hidden hostility. Intent becomes irrelevant. Context becomes secondary. The subjective reaction determines the moral verdict. That creates a moral system in which everyone must constantly monitor everybody else and themselves. What phrase was permitted? Did I use the correct terminology? Could my question be interpreted as offensive? Will someone report me? Should I say what I believe? Or should I smile, nod, and keep my mouth shut? That's not a population becoming more enlightened. It's a population becoming more anxious. And I would argue that the deepest harm is not political. It is moral. Natural rights morality begin with individual self-ownership. Your life belongs to you. Your body belongs to you. Your conscience belongs to you. Your peaceful thoughts and expressions belong to you. Other people possess the same rights. That creates a reciprocal moral obligation. I'm not allowed to force you to agree with me, and you're not allowed to force me to agree with you. I am allowed to criticize your ideas, and you're allowed to criticize mine. Neither one of us are allowed to use force or violence or government power simply because persuasion failed. But speech restrictions reverse that moral order. They increasingly teach that emotional discomfort creates an entitlement to control another person. That offense establishes victimhood. That victimhood establishes moral authority. And that moral authority justifies coercion. But natural rights do not depend on who is the most offended. They belong equally to everybody. A progressive student does not possess more speech rights than its conservative student. And a conservative student does not possess more rights than the progressive. A Christian does not have the right to silence an atheist. An atheist does not have a right to silence a Christian. A Muslim does not have the right to criminalize criticism of Islam. And the critic does not have the right to harass Muslims as individuals. People possess rights. Ideas remain open to challenge. That is the moral boundary. When we abandon it, morality becomes a competition for protected status. Whoever can claim the greatest harm gains the greatest control. Whoever controls the definition of harm controls the conversation. And whoever controls the conversation eventually controls the culture. So, what happens if we continue down this path? Well, we're going to produce a generation that knows the vocabulary of emotional safety, but not the discipline of intellectual courage. A generation skilled at identifying microaggressions, but unprepared to confront macro threats. A generation taught to report offensive opinions rather than refute them. A generation that values inclusion, but excludes dissenters. A generation that praises diversity of identity while fearing diversity of thought. A generation that can list American failures but cannot explain why millions of people still risk everything to live here. A generation that inherits unprecedented freedom and experiences that freedom as oppression because the freedom includes hearing people they dislike. A generation skilled at identifying microaggressions without realizing they're turning into macro wussies. That's not progress. Liberty and freedom of speech requires more than constitutional language. It requires a certain kind of citizen. A citizen capable of hearing offensive ideas without collapsing. A citizen willing to defend the rights of political enemies. A citizen who recognizes the difference between criticism and coercion. A citizen who understands that being offended is sometimes the price of living among free people. A citizen who can say, I despise what you believe, but I will not use the government to silence you. That requires strength. It requires gratitude. It requires moral consistency. And it requires remembering what earlier generations understood. Freedom is not preserved by people who need permission to speak. It's preserved by people willing to speak when permission is denied. The danger facing America is not only that government may someday place chains around our speech, it's that we're already teaching ourselves to wear those chains voluntarily. We're polishing them, giving them compassionate names, calling them safety, calling them inclusion, calling them protection, and handing them to our children as if they were moral progress. They are not. A nation of self-censoring citizens may still hold elections, it may still wave flags, it may still call itself free, but freedom that people are afraid to exercise is freedom in name only. If the next generation grows up believing that discomfort is danger, disagreement is hatred, and silence is kindness, America may not need an authoritarian government to take away its freedom. We will have surrendered it ourselves. And on that happy note, peace out from Virginia.